Today I'm going to do a second in a series of 4 sermons where I'm putting in conversation one of the canonical Gospels and one of the extra-canonical Gospels. And somebody asked me last week if I might say a little bit more about these extra-canonical Gospels, where they came from, what they are, so on and so forth. So I'll begin with that. So what's a Gospel? A Gospel is a story about Jesus or Jesus' teaching. It usually has a focus, not always, but usually has a focus on the passion narrative, on the narrative of his death, and sometimes of his resurrection. That's what they are. And so how'd we get more than 4 of them? We got 4 of them in our Bible, but it does seem that there are more. And for a long time, we knew that there were others because we had read letters or read ancient documents that referred to other Gospels other than the 4 we have. Okay? The one that seems most prominent in the literature is the Gospel according to Thomas, and we didn't have a copy of the Gospel according to Thomas, or even really a fragment, until 1945, when a library in Egypt called the Nag Hammadi Library, I'm not going to say that again, that library was dug up, and not only did we find a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, but several others. We found a part of a copy of the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of James, the Gospel of Signs. I mean, there's several of them. And then there have been other discoveries over the years, and so now we seem to have fragments of approximately 18 different Gospels. We don't have the whole thing on each of these. And so the question then is, where do they come from? How were they formed? And there's been this great detective work going on among biblical scholars to try and figure all of that out. But one thing is very clear is that the Gospels that we have, the 18 Gospels, okay, they were apparently fairly influential because what we have really is 7th and 8th century copies of them, which means they were copied over and over and over again in communities for whom they meant a lot. And now they're still with us. So I would say the ones that, only were copied once and were rejected, of course, we have no idea whether they were written. So scholars have tried to figure out what communities would put together which gospel and why. Right? They try and figure out which gospel is based on another gospel. Did the Gospel of Thomas borrow from the Gospel of John? Did the Gospel of James borrow from the Gospel of Mark? How does it all fit together? And they do that with the canonical Gospels too, recognizing that Mark is the source for both Luke and for Matthew, but that both Luke and Matthew have another source. We call that source Q, and so we don't have any copies of Q, but we assume it existed at some time, somewhere. You see how the detective work kind of goes and figure it out. So the Gospel according to Peter, that Gospel was found at Nag Hammadi, and we've also have a copy of it, or have a little fragment of papyrus that goes back to about 126 AD, okay, Common Era. So we know it was fairly early, but there was some argument when we first discovered it about whether it was based on the Gospel of Mark, and that in fact the Gospel of Peter had altered some of the events because they are a little different than the Gospel of Mark. But then when we began to get more copies of it, more fragments, and put it together, scholars reevaluated. And part of the reason they reevaluated is we came to a moment in scholarship when we recognized that we did not have to claim the historicity, the historical accuracy of the 4 canonical Gospels. There was a recognition in scholarship that really what these Gospels are interpretive stories. It matters how you tell the story of Jesus because that has to do with how you live and what your faith is about. And so they began to reevaluate the Gospel of Peter that I will read from, and they discovered through various kinds of language exercises that it was in fact a very early gospel. Not only that, but the passion narrative within it, the story of Jesus' death, may be the earliest one we have. Now, when you get to these dates and dating that scholars do, I have to tell you at a certain point I go, yeah, whatever. That'll change in another generation because somebody else will need a PhD and have to argue with you. All right, but the basic outline is nevertheless true. There were a variety of communities that told the story of Jesus. It mattered to them how it was told because it was a matter of faith for them. And these various communities influenced one another over time, and eventually the Christian church decided on the 4 canonical Gospels. They said those are the standard for us. But that doesn't mean that the conversation with these other Gospels is ridiculous or nonsense. They were part of our tradition from the very beginning. And we can wrestle with them and put them in conversation with other texts. But in the Christian church, we have, at least for the time being, remember, we can change it, said these canonical Gospels are the ones that we'd like to rely on when we think about telling the story in a way that matters. So let me first read the little piece of this Gospel of Peter. It has to do with the resurrection story, and then I'm going to read the resurrection story from the Gospel of Luke. And you'll see differences and you'll see similarities. Early at first light on the Sabbath, a crowd came from Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside to see the sealed tomb. But during the night before the Lord's day dawned, while the soldiers were on guard in pairs during each watch, a loud noise came from the sky, and they saw the skies open up, and 2 men came down from there in a burst of light, and they approached the tomb. The stone that had been pushed against the entrance began to roll by itself and moved away to one side. Then the tomb opened up, and both young men went inside. Now when these soldiers saw this, they roused the officer from his sleep along with the elders. Remember, they were also keeping watch. While they were explaining what they had seen, again they see 3 men leaving the tomb, 2 supporting the third. And a cross was following them. The heads of the 2 men reached up into the sky, while the head of the third, whom they led by the hand, reached beyond the skies. And they heard a voice from the sky say, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And an answer was heard from the cross, "Yes." And that's a little piece of the Gospel of Peter. It's called the Gospel of Peter because apparently somewhere in the Gospel it said that Peter remembered these things and wrote them down. So now I'll read from the more familiar text of the Gospel according to Luke. Beginning in 24, well, you listen as the Spirit speaks to you. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Humankind must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the 3rd day rise again?" Then they remembered Jesus' words. And returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale. They didn't believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, and stooping and looking in, Peter saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Hear what the Spirit is saying to our church. So all this talk about the historical accuracy of the Gospels, whether Jesus was raised or not raised, whether he was born of a virgin or not born of a virgin, all of these things have sort of stirred people's faith or really kind of let the foundations for some people crumble underneath them. And you all know we have a lot of books out there that deconstruct Christian faith, other kinds of faiths, on the basis of our understanding that these Gospels aren't exactly telling the truth according to 20th century standards. Okay? And it seems like they keep writing books and keep writing books, and the latest book of this kind, and probably the worst, is a book called Divinity of Doubt by Vince Bugliosi. Okay, now, Jan heard about this book. She was listening to him be interviewed on the radio, and she was so incensed by it that she bought me the book so that I would eviscerate it in a column. Okay? So I've read the book. Well, actually, it was so hard to read the book. It was just so annoying and so uninformed and so stupid. It was just driving me crazy. You know, because he wanted to tear apart the faith. And you know, he seemed to have some idea of God that was based on a literal reading of the text and poll data on what most Americans believe. This isn't exactly the place that I'd go to for theological reflection, but nevertheless, that's what he was basing it on. And so he was objecting, for instance, to Genesis. How can we trust Genesis? We don't know the author, he says. Well, duh. All you have to do is read even the most rudimentary scholarship, and what you find out is that Genesis is a lot of layers of interpretation. They are constructed, in fact, it was constructed much the way some of these Gospels were constructed. Communities adding parts to the story, editing parts to the story, and until it really began to shine what the Spirit might have to say within it. But he was making a contribution. The flap of the book said that no one else had made over these many years that we were having this conversation. And then, as if on cue, having discovered now that modernity had undercut this literal interpretation of the text, he brings up the problem of suffering. Suffering. It's something that really is on our minds a lot of the time. I mean, we avoid suffering at all costs. So he brings up suffering, and he, of course, says that, well, you know, it's ridiculous to believe in this God who controls everything and who takes care of everything and who purports to be good when this God lets suffering happen, right? How can there be a good God with suffering in the world? And I say, well, you have a point, Vince. It's very difficult to figure out how there can be a good God in a world with suffering if you assume this God that comes out of a literal interpretation of this text, who's kind of up there in heaven, pulling all the strings, making this, that, and the other thing happen. But if we don't think of God that way, if we think of God as moving and allowing God's love and expression to develop as creation develops, if we see God as inherent and infused into the process, well, then we don't see God as this controlling God at every moment. We see God as moving us and shaping us. There's that beautiful sculpture by Rodin. He actually tried it several times, but of the hand of God, you know, that's creating, and in the hand you see the human being that God is creating. And you can just tell, I just love the way Rodin sculpts because you can feel the muscles, right? You can just tell that the hand has to be flexible because the creation itself is moving and shifting and shaping. No, I'm not so sure we see a God that just makes things happen the way God wants to make things happen. We see a God that's very much real in creation's history. But nevertheless, Bugliosi would say, why should we believe in any God if there is suffering in the world? And if we were to just leave it at that, to say, well, you know, there's suffering in the world because God can't do anything about it, that's basically what I just said, right? Then that's not going to do much for us. Telling the story that way isn't going to help us with suffering because it is something that we deal with. We're afraid that we will lose things. Many of us have lost loves, Some people have lost children. Some people have lost any sense of the future when they manage to drown their sorrows in the midst of drink. There's real suffering, and then oftentimes we say, and our suffering here in Marin is just so little as compared to other people's suffering. And at a certain point that's true. At another point you have to say that suffering is suffering, and it's not really something you can compare one person to another. We need a context to understand it, to live with it. And the interesting thing is, our Gospels are seeking to do that. Now, they're doing so in describing things in their own way, with their own particular worldview and understanding. But they're trying to understand how to deal with the suffering. How does it fit into our lives? That's what the Gospel according to Peter is doing. And how does it see suffering? How does it see God working with suffering? Well, it seems as though after the suffering of the crucifixion, after the death and the burial, God is able to make a move to help with the rising. But Jesus in that gospel seems not victorious, but to me almost seemed stooped over, as though he had to be held up by these other two. And when Jesus speaks, it's not Jesus, it's the cross that speaks, as though for the Gospel of Peter, the suffering is always present, even as you move into the new moment of new life. That seems to me as though that could be an appropriate story for some communities, in some circumstances. I mean, you can consider a community that is dealing with persecution. You know, that's a story that I understand. That story makes some sense to say, well, this is just the way it is, that suffering is always present, but nevertheless, God is present with us, holding us, lifting us. It matters how you tell the story. But Luke is a little different. Luke tells the story differently and says, no, when the rising comes, it's pure light. When it's announced, it's not announced as though the suffering and the horror of the past is bearing down upon us at all times. No, the new life and the new light is able to obliterate the darkness. That's Luke's story. And why? I think this is just beautiful. The Gospel of Peter has no women. The feminine is not in the story. That generative part of us that sees the new thing, that recognizes that new life can indeed emerge. That's in the middle of Luke's story that carries us into this place of new light and new life. Not completely shadowed by the suffering. So which one is true? Both deal with the facts, but it matters how you tell the story. How it is that you structure your life, how it is that you believe. And so if we say we believe that the Christ is risen, that we believe that this new light and new life is possible, that obliterates the darkness and the hopelessness, well, if we say that, that becomes a habit of the heart, a way that we tell the story. Barbara and I went to a movie at the Raffel a couple of days ago called The Tree of Life. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I hope not to insult you. It's possibly the worst movie I've ever seen. But it had a point, and I'd like to tell you enough about the movie so you can get the point without having to watch the movie. It was called A Tone Poem. All right, and in fairness, for instance, Kay Collette loved this movie, so maybe you should walk out of here with sort of a neutral feeling about it. It might be great, it might be horrible, kind of a neutral thing, but it was a tone poem, is what they said, because there were two things put up side by side. One was the reminiscences of the director's life in the 50s. He had a father who had obviously fought in the Second World War, and who carried the hurt. And he carried it and expressed it by being harsh, sometimes violent, especially towards the older son. And the older son struggled with this, and it formed his character in a way that, was destructive. On the other hand, the memory of the mother, at one point the mother was literally floating as she danced up around the trees, and she was the symbol of grace, the symbol of new life in it all. And what he was trying to do was put this in perspective, because side by side with this sort of pieces and pastiche of story from this household in the 50s was this panorama of images that evoked the creation. So, all the images of the galaxies and the images of volcanoes and waterfalls. And they tried even to have a little dinosaur in there so that you could get a sweep of creation. It's like you put those things side by side. And the idea is to say that the suffering that was experienced in that life has to be seen in the context of the whole creation, which is in fact a beautiful and glorious thing. The movie really asks the question, are you going to go with the harshness, the judgment, the disappointment? Is that what's always going to stay with you? Or are you going to open your heart to the possibility of new life and grace? When we say we believe that Christ is risen, among other things, what we mean is a habit of the heart, telling ourselves a story that has the ending that suffering is real, but new life is possible. What's the story we tell ourselves here about us? I've heard two stories. I have occasionally, not very often, heard the story that, we're a congregation, we just fight all the time. We fought about civil rights, we fought about gay people, we fought about music, we fought about the building, we fight about everything, we split and we leave. Okay? That's one way to tell the story, that the suffering is always kind of there and with us, but there's a different way to tell this story. One way to tell the story of this congregation is a congregation that has always moved towards the front, trying to reach for whatever it is that's next. And in that, it challenges many people. But in that, new life comes. One of the earliest debates, modernist, fundamentalist debates, had to do with Sabbath keeping. I'll say more about this later, but Arthur Crosby, who I mentioned a few weeks ago, one of my predecessors, preached 2 sermons on the Sabbath where he was challenging the fundamentalist view. That's what this pulpit's always done. There's always new life here. That's one way to tell that story. Doesn't deny, you understand, the splits and the difficulty, but it's another way to tell it. And what do you tell yourselves in your own stories? Do you tell yourself a story that I'm a certain way and I cannot change? That there's always that suffering, that pressure hanging over me, and I really can't do anything to change it? Well, a different habit of the heart can open up new possibilities, because we believe that there is possibility in change. There is new life and new light that can obliterate that which is past. A habit of the heart. How we tell our story matters. Mattered for these communities. It mattered for the people who edited Genesis. It matters now, and it matters more than ever that you and I tell our story, a good news story, to the people all around us. Amen.